Sideways. As we close out on the Beatitudes, the final point that I want to make in this summary, this just a couple of points here, is for us to understand the contrast between what Jesus is calling us to in the Beatitudes with what we find in the world. So the world is focused on two main things: self-promotion and self-protection. In corporate America, in school, just about anywhere you go, people want to promote themselves, elevate themselves, exalt themselves, or they want to protect themselves and make sure that they're not injured or they're not harmed or they're not hurt in any way. And it's similar to the text when Jesus talks about how the Gentiles are in the world and how they seek authority, which is part of this self-promotion idea. And Jesus says in Matthew 20, verse 26, "It shall not be so among you." And when you think about, we've looked at all these verses of the Beatitudes, but when you think about the details of what we discussed, it's the opposite of these 2 points, right? At the beginning especially, there's no self-promotion in someone who is poor in spirit, someone who is meek or gentle, right? It's the opposite of self-promotion. And then as we close out the Beatitudes, and Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people insult you or revile you or harm you, persecute you." That's the opposite of self-protection, right? That's allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and standing up for what is right, even in the face of pain. So just wanted to have that as a closeout. We literally ran out of time and didn't get to wrap that up. But that concludes the Beatitudes. And then we come to what some have called the similitudes, the idea of a comparison. Jesus compares us and proclaims that we are these very different things, right? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. These are the similitudes, and it talks to the calling that we have that is important to add to the first principle, which is the character, which is what we studied in the Beatitudes. So let's do what we've done a number of times and read the text. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16. This will be the first half of the class before we do 17 through 20 in the second half. 13 through 16, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." So salt and light are the topics for the first part of our class here. And as we begin, and what's the first thing that comes to your mind, or the first couple of things that come to your mind when you think about the value of salt? What are the characteristics or the properties? I don't know if properties is the right word, but how we use it to do certain things. What are those things? Okay, as a preservative is probably the thing that comes to mind most often. I never ate Spam before I was married, and Kelly likes fried Spam. And if you want to know how long Spam will last, look at the label. It'll last literally forever because there's so many milligrams of sodium in there. It's a preservative, right? And it's used as such. And years ago, before refrigeration and before, a lot of the modern technology that we have, things would be salted and they would last, right? And then, of course, when we're sitting down at a 16-ounce ribeye steak, are we wanting to preserve that when we use salt? No, because we don't want that steak to be preserved for very long. We're about to consume it, right? We use it also as an enhancer or enhancement to flavor, right? It brings it out. So you think about those two things, but especially the idea of the main function as a preservative. And think about what Jesus has just said. Verse 11, the world is going to hate you. They're going to insult you. They're going to persecute you. They're going to malign you. And then the next words out of his mouth are, you are the salt of the earth. The world's going to hate you, but you are the world's only hope. They need to be preserved. They need the properties that salt can bring to their life. And Jesus says, you are it. You are the salt of the earth. And so the good things that salt does, that we can easily see and experience, particularly thinking about the first century when Jesus is ministering, right? Long before electricity, long before refrigeration. It was extremely important. And note as we begin the contrast that even though the world will hate him, or hate Christians, or hate Jesus and his disciples, that we will be there for that preserving aspect. Also, I think an important point with both of these things, with salt and with light, the new kingdom is not intended to isolate itself from the world, but to influence people in the world. So that's why he uses these things, right? They have an undeniable and strong influence when used for the purpose that is intended, right? We've got all these lights on in here. The study would be difficult in the dark. I mean, maybe not with the iPad or your phones or whatever, but books and seeing one another. Light eradicates darkness. And Jesus would save himself in the Gospel of John. I am the light of the world, right? And he tells us here, we are the light of the world, but we should always remember God put us here to influence it in a positive way, not to isolate ourselves. Salt in isolation does nothing. Salt, when applied and used properly, is extremely valuable. The same is true for us. All right, we've kind of already talked about some of this, and I just want to kind of maybe say this explicitly. Salt enhances, salt preserves, and what I want to say that's kind of that next step, or let me ask you, are there any other things that you would want us to emphasize? There's more that we could dig into. We could talk about salt the whole class, and I don't intend for us to do that. But what other uses of salt might be applicable to what Jesus intends to communicate? I mean, he obviously has some intent, right? It's not we're literal salt. It's that we as Christians do things similar to what salt does, and we've talked about that. But any other things that you would add to this list? There certainly are, you can read some commentaries and listen to some different preachers or ministers on this topic and get other things. Yes, sir. Oh, right. Yep. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. And we're kind of jumping to the next verse there, but it's totally fine to do that because we're going to hopefully cover all this quickly. But salt is sodium chloride. It never ceases to be that. That's a good example of a way in which you might think about someone considering salt to have lost its savor. But Jesus then ultimately is talking about what? Well, he's talking about us. If we don't fulfill the purpose that he intends for us as salt to fulfill, we're useless, right? And you can read some different commentators on this idea of salt losing its flavor by some dilution, by some different means where it wouldn't be effective as pure salt would be. But it is interesting that he says that, and certainly when you think about us being salt and what salt does, we can enhance life for people, we can preserve life for people, or we can absolutely fail in those tasks. And then we're salt that's lost its savor. So it's certainly easiest to make the application when we look to ourselves. Anybody else got a thought on another salt? Okay. Yeah, purity and could even be purification, I think. I'm going to kind of take that and go a step further. The value, this is not something to spend a lot of time on, but our English word salary comes from the Latin word salt. And historically, you could see going back to like Justin's comment on the value of salt. There's the idiomatic expression, someone not being worth their salt they would not be worth the money that they are paid. Going back to the idea of purification as another possible function, and that may not be exactly what you were talking about, the purity of the salt itself. I might be taking that and running a little bit more with it. Even things like gargling with salt water has a special purpose that would point towards some purification property, some cleansing property. And that's the only other thing that I would want to say here, but there's some other things that could be said, like some disinfectant, and you can do a Google search and be like 100 uses for salt. We're not doing that tonight, but ultimately I want to say it saves. As a preservative, it would save people's lives centuries ago, right? Because the food that was preserved meant that people didn't starve in the wintertime. And Jesus ultimately is saying that we are going to have that influence as his servants. And 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, I've quoted that a bunch of times, but we have this treasure in earthen vessels so the surpassing greatness of the power might be of God and not from ourselves. We are the ones that proclaim the gospel, and there's a sense in which we save, right? We don't save. The blood of Jesus saves. God saves. The grace of God, all these things. That's absolutely the means by which we're saved. But God has chosen, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, by the foolishness of the message preached for his message of salvation to be communicated and conveyed. And so I think all of these things are included in what Jesus is wanting to advocate for us being the salt of the earth. Salt has got to be salty, right? I was thinking of an illustration that we won't take the time. That might be why I don't get through my classes. Too many personal stories. The question here, though, are we living up to the call of Jesus to enhance, preserve, and save the world? And this is what Rusty was talking about when Jesus says in that next verse. I was saying the next verse is right there in the very first verse, so forgive me for that. If the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? Certainly, when we think about what salt does, we've got to be this in every relationship, right? You're the salt of the earth, and that means you provide that, what? In your families. Hopefully, we try to enhance or preserve or save in our marriages, right? In our relationship with our spouse, in our relationship with our children as parents, and then in the workplace, like anywhere in the world that we come into contact, we are to be the light or the salt. So at school or at work, are we that? And then, of course, in the church, we should all be that for each other. We could also say too much salt can be a problem, and maybe that's when we're only here in the church and the church problems. But sorry, that's just bad humor in my brain. But are we living up to the call, and may God bless us to live up to the call. Colossians 4, verse 6. Just want to read that one quickly. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. That lets us know a big part of how we can be the salt of the earth is by the words that we speak, right? And our words, James in James chapter 3, what does he say about the tongue? The tongue is a what? It's full of what? The tongue is an unruly evil and full of deadly poison. And then here, Colossians 4:6, it could be the means by which you administer salt. So it could be a great blessing or a great danger. And may God help us to let our speech be seasoned, as it were, with salt. All right, let me go back here. That's what I've got on salt. Now, if you're thinking about Mark 9, 49, and 50, my plan is not for us to dig into all that. We could talk about that verse. For everyone will be salted with fire, Mark 9, 49. Salt is good, Mark 9, 50. Have salt in yourselves, Jesus says in that verse, the second half, and be at peace with one another. So we could have a whole other lesson and dig deeper into that, and it would probably be a good study and worth our time. I'm just mentioning it now so you know I'm not intentionally or unintentionally overlooking it. Yes, sir.
You've mentioned the word influence a couple times, right? And that, certainly when you read Colossians 4:6 comes to mind.
Yep.
Seasoned with salt. And so I think you have to be careful not to bludgeon people with salt.
Yeah.
Because that's going to kill them. And so knowing the right things to say, when to say it, how to use the salt for good instead of for evil.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, realizing the power of it, right? Salt's a pretty awesome thing, but you don't take a salt shaker and take the top off and just pour it on your steak, and then, like if you imagine doing that, and the people at the table, if you're at a restaurant, be like, it just would be awful, right? It's a powerful influence, and the same thing for us as salt. Like you could literally beat someone up with the Word of God every day and never give them a break, and you probably have buried them in salt and will never hope to do anything except they're going to run to the water fountain when they see you coming. Adam?
I remember early on that I was there, Mitch read a recipe.
Yeah.
Full lot of salt.
Nice.
And we didn't realize it, obviously, until you wouldn't eat it. But I mean, but to the point, it's like it's not, you can't now, you want to eat it.
Right.
And the same thing, it's like if you're just, like, it says season with salt. Season is like, it's to make it palatable so it's understandable, which we would accept it and eat and take it in.
Right.
And, it's not like it's not pleasant with it.
Yeah, yeah. Salt's just a nice little amount is really wonderful, and then past that, it's not good. Or if you don't have enough, right? It's especially for something that you're used to eating with salt, then it's, oh man, this is flavorless. Anybody else? We do have a couple minutes. I kind of flew through that, and I think we're going to need like 15, maybe 18 minutes for the other point, but right now we've got like 23 minutes. Valerie. Yeah. Yep. Right. 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 No. I mean, I don't know maybe how you're distinguishing that from what we're saying. Definitely, it's a pretty emphatic statement when it says you are the salt. It just is what you are, and hopefully you're fulfilling that function. I don't know, Woody, can you translate what Valerie just said? I just don't know how it's different than what we've already said.
The other thing about salt, you've heard stories of those who were shipwrecked or on a raft, and they're thirsty.
Mm.
The last thing you want to do is drink that mound of water that's just surrounding you, because what salt does, it makes you thirsty.
Yeah.
And so I always look at this as thinking, if we are the salt of the earth, we want to draw people to us. We want to make them thirsty for the life we are trying to live. And
Right.
glory, because we are to glorify God in all that we do. So that's the other aspect I was thinking about. Is salt just, I can't taste salt anymore. I guess it's my old age, but the older I get, the worse I try to stay away from it. But it does make me thirsty, and I don't know, maybe that's an aspect of this too.
Yeah, okay. If you didn't hear what Woody said, he was talking about how salt makes you thirsty, and if we can make someone thirsty for the water of life, or that hunger and thirst for righteousness, if we can aid in bringing that to reality for other people, that might be another way that we would consider salt. Walker?
Salt's also really prevalent everywhere. So is light, obviously.
Yep.
So maybe it's another thing that is saying it's the quality of being out there, being anything.
Yep. Pervasive. Yep. Sounds good. Anybody else have a hand? Yes, ma'am.
This is just a thought that came to me, that salt melts ice.
Oh, yeah.
And so
Yep.
I think we should be warm and friendly people,
Hmm.
try to melt the icy hearts of the world.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Definitely need to restate that one. The idea of salting the roads. We lived in St. Louis where that happened quite often, and salt melts that ice. And if we could melt the icy hearts of men and women who at times are very cold or hard-hearted, that would certainly be a good influence and kind of a means by which we might be the salt of the earth. So yeah, it's a great thought. Okay, we'll do light quickly, and then we'll get into the law. So you are the light of the world. Jesus says, you don't light a lamp and then cover it up. That just wouldn't make sense. And I think ultimately what he's trying to say is, let your light shine. I mean, he says that explicitly in verse 16, but don't let it be covered up. Certainly don't intentionally cover it up. And that's something that we could do at times. We might be ashamed of our faith, or not as confident or bold to confess Jesus before men. And then Jesus says, you're really like someone throwing a big overcoat over the lamp in the room, and you just don't ever do that. Light should have free reign to influence the darkness that is present, right? And to eradicate that. So light clearly does that, and as we are the light of the world, we should be doing the same. A couple of points here, I think, just kind of show how salt and light he's kind of saying the same thing, right? You could certainly see how light shines in the darkness and kind of enhances your experience, right? God made the sun, the greater light from Genesis. It's 93 million miles away from the earth, and yet it provides light during the day and heat. It's a very powerful force in our solar system that just makes life better. And it shows us the way. It preserves life and ultimately saves life, right? Sun certainly is an example of that. I think it's Psalm 119, 105. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. It's the means by which we are enlightened, or spiritually our eyes are able to see, and so it has the same kind of effects that salt has, to enhance, to preserve, and ultimately to save. So the question is your light bright or dim? Right? The brightness of the sun versus the reflection of the sun against the moon, very different brightness. You go to Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart and you see a whole row of light bulbs, and there's all manner of different brightness levels, right? Watts and lumens and various and sundry measurements that we've come up with. Another thing that I think ties these two principles together, the salt and the light, is, what did we say a way to manifest our salt is? It's in our speech, right? Colossians 4 verse 6. And we see a similar idea where light is discussed here in Philippians chapter 2. Verse 14 says, do all things without grumbling and disputing. Well, that's part of having your speech seasoned with salt, right? You're not just a constant complainer, Debbie Downer, Mr. or Mrs. Negativity, right? Paul says, don't do that. So that what? You will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. So we're lights in a dark world, Philippians 2:15, and part of how we show our light is the same way that we show our speech is seasoned with salt. And here it's specifically this prohibition, do all things without grumbling and complaining. So the words that we speak are a big way for us to be salt and light. And then verse 16, let your light shine. Just let it happen. Don't try to stop it. Certainly don't be ashamed of it. May God help us not to be cowards with respect to our faith, but just let it do what it does, right? He's saying, do not hide it. He's saying, do it that men may see. And then, of course, the purpose is that God may be glorified. And you can see the wisdom of Jesus here, and how, depending on the point that he wants to make and needs to make based on something that's important for our lives in this new kingdom, he says different things. They're not conflicting. But I'm saying that because in Matthew 5:16, he says, let your light so shine that men may see your good works. And the purpose isn't to glorify ourselves. The purpose is to glorify God. And that's the difference. Because in Matthew chapter 6, just a few verses later, Jesus is going to have this whole section that says, beware about practicing your righteousness to be seen of men. And he's going to talk about fasting, and he's talking about giving of your alms, and he's going to talk about praying. And just make sure that when you do these righteous good things, that you don't do it just to be seen. So that shouldn't be ever with the purpose for us to glorify ourselves or just to present ourselves as righteous. But it's perfectly fine and good and expected, and what Jesus says to do, to let people see the good works for God to be glorified. And so the intent for us is to take ourselves out of the equation and not do it with the purpose of glorifying ourselves. You know, there are certain things that we can ensure that we do or don't do. And particularly in Matthew chapter 6, what does he say you particularly should make sure not to do right before you do a good work? Don't what? Yeah. Don't blow a trumpet. Right? Hey, everybody, I'm going to do something pretty awesome. You won't even believe how awesome this check is. I'm about to put in the box in the back on the left-hand side if you want to get a picture. Right? There's so many zeros after the one on this check. Like there's nothing good there. But when our purpose is to glorify God, it's like Jesus said in the preceding verses, the light can't be hidden. If we're all lights, it just can't be hidden. And God is going to be glorified. People are going to be like, wow. Right? And when you look at the example of Jesus, he was humble. He took himself out of the equation. He shows us how to do that. But everyone, when Jesus spoke or performed miracles, everyone was like, wow. And certainly God was glorified. All right, we got 10 more minutes, 11 more minutes. Let's talk about Jesus and the law. Matthew 5:17 through 20, verse 17 beginning. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I came to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Verse 20, we don't want to start at the end necessarily, but that's one of those verses that is kind of at the heart of this new kingdom, and in stark contrast to what people probably thought when they observed the scribes and the Pharisees. They observed them and thought, wow, this is the salt of the earth. This is the light of the world. And just like, no, your righteousness, you're going to have to do better. And I would advocate Matthew 5:20 as kind of one of those theme verses of the Sermon on the Mount for us to start to understand the righteousness that God really expects, and look at the life of the Pharisees and how they're presented in the Bible and in the ministry of Jesus, and we can learn something about what Jesus means here. Why do you suppose Jesus starts off with these words, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets? Yep. So the subsequent teaching could have been getting them ready to prepare them for what he was about to say. Anybody else got any other thoughts? Brian? Right. And why do you think they might have thought he was coming to abolish the law? Somebody said something? Who said something? Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Let me. Okay. Yes, Heather. Yep. Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Right. Yeah, that's right. Did you have something?
Yeah, an abolishment of the Jewish law probably would have completely shut off all Jews
Right.
from believing in him.
Right.
And he's saying that's not what this is about. I'm here to fulfill it. So
Right.
calling Jews and Gentiles both.
Yeah, that's right. Let me kind of lead you in a little bit of a direction and kind of see where I kind of want us to go. Do you think the majority of Jews thought about the law, or excuse me, what do you think the majority of Jews thought about the law of Moses and the traditions of the Pharisees? What do you think the Jews thought about that? Here's the law of Moses, here's the traditions of the Pharisees. But I don't think the Jews thought that. I think the Jews would have looked at the Pharisees and been like, those are equal. Those are the same. And then, and just stick with me here, and you could dissent. That's totally fine to disagree with me. But then look at Jesus at the time that he preaches this sermon. Because the everyday Jew, they would have looked at the words of the Pharisees and be like, now that's the gospel truth. These guys have the law. And then Jesus is totally butting heads with the Pharisees. By the time he's preaching this sermon, he's already butted heads with them in Mark 2 and Luke 6, which is the same account about the disciples plucking the heads of grain from wheat on the Sabbath day and eating that. And the Pharisees are like, do you think this is okay? This is absolutely not okay. And Jesus is like, it's fine. Like, it's putting the cornflakes from the bowl up to your mouth. You can do that on the Sabbath day. John 5, 2 through 18 is another example. Jesus butting heads with the Pharisees. And it's possible that the Jews thought, hey, the Pharisees, they're the keepers of the law. And then Jesus is totally butting heads with the Pharisees. And if Jesus is butting heads with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are the keepers of the law, maybe Jesus came to destroy this law. Or maybe the law is just, not important. And in what Jesus is saying here, he's saying, don't think that. Don't think like the Pharisee. The point is to draw a very stark contrast between the Pharisees and the law, even though most Jews probably thought the Pharisees and the law were like one and the same. And so he's like, don't think I came to destroy this. Just because I'm butting heads with the Pharisees who act like they're the keepers of the law, they really have missed the law, right? I've come to fulfill it. So that's something that makes sense to me. Certainly, other points that have been made, I think, have been good, and I'm not trying to advocate this as a definitive gospel truth, but certainly something that makes a powerful point to me about what Jesus is saying here. Phil?
I think to go along with what you're saying is, when people think about the Pharisees, that was an unattainable status.
Yeah. Yep.
The Pharisees had taken that as a gatekeeper, exclusivity, and
Right.
folks can't attain this.
Right.
So Jesus is blowing right through that.
Yep.
I mean, the law and the prophets, he's bringing the gospel right down to everybody.
Yep.
Everybody's a good priest.
Yep, that's right. That's right. All right, I'm going afterburners for 3. Oh, Collins.
I think that what Jesus is also trying to say is that, hey, guys, I'm not bringing anything new.
Yep,
The only thing that you already knew, the foundation.
that's right.
I came to build on it, and I came to fulfill it.
That's right.
So don't let it be like trying to change anything that you already know.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually segues real good for my last point, so I'm just going to fly through this. Hang with me for a couple minutes. He says, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law. I'm going to fulfill every last minute detail. The iota was the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet. The dot was actually, I've got the Greek on this one. It literally means a little horn. It's the point or extremity which distinguishes some Hebrew letters from other letters. And what Jesus said, the tiniest little thing, I got an example of this. Here's 2 Hebrew letters. This little like extra little horn on that side, that's the dot. That's what Jesus, like, even the slightest little stitch of a letter that makes it different from another letter, I'm going to fulfill it that completely and that fully and that absolutely, right? So this is a great point. This goes to what Collins just said here, and I'm actually just quoting a Paul Earnhardt. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but I want to give him credit for it. Jesus' sermon is not a radical departure from the law, but the natural extension of the 2 great commandments found in the law. The law said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, Deuteronomy 6. The law said, love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18. And Jesus is going to teach them what that means. Woody's going to start teaching you what that means when Jesus says, you've heard that it was said of old, you shall not murder. He says, but I say to you, you shall not be angry at your brother even. And if you're going to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself, everything Jesus is going to teach is going to show us the natural extension of his teaching is the fulfillment of the law and not a departure of or an abolishment of. All right, explain verse 19. It's rough that we've only got a couple minutes here. Like Jesus says, whoever annuls one of these laws is the least in the kingdom of heaven. I wanted to have a nice awkward moment and say, who wants to go first? We don't have time to give you the microphone. Who do you think this whole section is referring to, though? Hint, verse 20. I mean, I think he's letting them know, whether or not it's directed to, at, or about, he's letting them know the Pharisees, they're just not what they make themselves out to be. They're not what they appear to be. They appear to be righteous, but they're not. And I don't have time to really develop this properly, but when Jesus says, if you break one of the least of these commandments, you're going to be least in the kingdom of heaven, do you think that means he's saying you're going to get some nosebleed seats, but you can still go to heaven? I think if you think about the context of the pride of the Pharisees, if they came into your assembly, normally they would have all the best seats, and they'd start walking to those, and you come into my house, and they're walking toward the best seats. I'm like, no, you don't get the best seat. You're going to get the least seat in my house, which means you get to stand here in the corner. What do you think a Pharisee is going to say when I say, you get to stand here in the corner? Oh, well, I think standing in the corner is just fine. No, they were prideful. They were arrogant. They were conceited. They were too good to be the least in the kingdom of heaven, right? So what are they going to do? If you're not going to give me my rightful seat at the top of the house, I'm leaving. I'm out. Peace. Deuces. I'm rolling. For them, being the least in the kingdom wasn't going to be an option. You going to debate me on that one? There's a lot of different things that commentators say about verse 19. That's all I got. We've already talked about verse 20.